Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to part 2 of Lecture 7 on Hedonistic Utilitarianism. So in the first part of the lecture, we discussed briefly who Jeremy Bentham was, and we started talking about utilitarianism, trying to carve out what kind of theory it is in a general sense. We talked about, an important distinction within utilitarianism between act and rule utilitarianism. But more importantly, we talked about how utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral theory and how it's teleological and, obviously what exactly those terms mean as well. So, and hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of the trolley dilemma, and enjoyed watching that video as well. So now, for the part 2, we're going to go ahead and turn our focus more to Bentham again and to his specific formulation of utilitarianism and what he gives us. And we're going to see, especially with his rough, crude formulation as opposed to Mill's down the road, the ways in which it's very hedonistic, right, and reminiscent of the kinds of things that Epicurus said. So speaking of that, hedonism, this was discussed in the introduction and the editor's remarks in our textbook when I had you, this part on Epicurus that I had you read in their introduction to hedonism. They mentioned that there was a distinction between these two different forms of hedonism: psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. So I just wanted to pick up on that and mention that there are two very important, distinct, different versions of hedonism. And just because somebody is a hedonist in one sense does not mean they're going to be a hedonist in the other. So let me explain. So again, what is hedonism? It's the philosophical theory that places the pursuit of pleasure, above all else. Pleasure is what matters. Okay, and that's exactly what Epicurus said. That's exactly what Bentham's going to say, and that's exactly what Mill will tell us in the next lecture. Okay? But here we want to distinguish, again, between these two important versions of hedonism. So psychological, and again, the editors pointed this out in the textbook as well, but it was in the reading associated with Lecture 6, for what it's worth. So there's a psychological hedonism. What is that? It's a descriptive theory. The psychological hedonist says, for better or worse, there's no moral undertones, and that's the key point here. For better or worse, as a matter of fact, we just do pursue pleasure, right? It's kind of like a natural law or a psychological fact or feature of us, right? There's no moral undertones. It's not prescribing any course of action. The psychological hedonist just says, we do, as a matter of fact, pursue pleasure. And in fact, maybe, there might be psychological hedonists out there for whom then the job of morality is to help us overcome that natural tendency to pursue pleasure. Maybe the job of morality is then to help us see that at times we ought to set aside our natural desire to pursue our own pleasure, right? So just because somebody's a psychological hedonist doesn't mean that they think we ought to do whatever promotes, our own pleasure. Okay, so that's where the difference comes in. Ethical hedonism is a moral, prescriptive view, and it suggests that we ought to do the kinds of things that are conducive to, promoting pleasure, right? So typically, if somebody's an ethical hedonist, they're going to be a psychological hedonist. But I think it's important to point this distinction out because there are several psychological hedonists. There are several examples of psychological hedonists who would not consider themselves ethical hedonists. So it's one thing to say, look, we have a natural tendency to pursue pleasure. It's another thing to say we ought to do the kinds of things to help us promote this pursuit of pleasure. Okay, and that's ethical hedonism. It has that moral undertone. And Bentham is going to endorse both, as I point out at the bottom of slide 12. Right, he's going to hammer home both psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. And I give you quotes now. Again, we don't have an excerpt from Bentham, right? So this is all from his philosophy. Actually, I took it from the previous textbook I worked with. And so when I put Bentham in parentheses, that's again coming from the previous textbook I worked with, since we don't have an excerpt from anything that Bentham wrote, although they did mention Bentham in the introduction. Pleasures and pains, he says on page, this is slide 13, pleasures and pains, quote, govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Okay, that's him coming out and endorsing psychological hedonism. Okay? Everything we do is dictated by this pursuit of pleasure. Okay? As he says, this is a quote, an article of property, an estate in land, for instance, is valuable on what account? On account of the pleasures of all kinds which it enables a man to produce, and what comes to the same thing, the pains of all kinds which it enables him to avert. Okay? So everything we pursue, right? When we pursue it, it's because we think it promotes pleasure or helps us avoid pain. Everything we do is dictated by this desire to promote pleasure and reduce pain. Okay, and then, so again, that's him. Those first two quotes that I mentioned on this slide, right? That's him, right? Indicating, or those quotes are indicative of his psychological hedonism. And then he's going to use these kinds of observations as a foundation for the utilitarianism that he's going to advance then. So based on this psychological hedonism, he's going to say we ought to do the kinds of things that will help us promote this facilitation of pleasure and this avoidance of pain. Okay, so he suggests utilitarianism reflects the significant roles that pleasures and pains play in our lives. He says the principle of utility, quote, recognizes this subjection to pleasures and pains and assumes it for the foundation of that system, namely utilitarianism, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity, a fancy word for happiness, by the hands of reason and of law. So he's basically saying, my moral theory, utilitarianism, rests upon psychological hedonism's considerations of what matters to us, namely just pleasures and avoiding pains. Okay, so again, that was slide 13. Right, I hope to offer evidence there for both his psychological hedonism and again his ethical hedonism. Right, utilitarianism. His utilitarianism is basically ethical hedonism. Right, we ought to do whatever will help facilitate this pursuit of pleasure and this avoidance of pain. Now, don't get the wrong idea. It's not a selfish thing, right? And all these utilitarians will come right on immediately, make pains to suggest, right? It's not me, myself, and I. It's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Right? So, but having considered that, right, it's basically ethical hedonism, right? How we always ought to do whatever promotes the greatest happiness or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. And do whatever will facilitate that. That's ethical hedonism. So turning to slide 14, we have mentioned this utility principle. So that's basically the guiding principle of utilitarianism. I mentioned this on the first part when I mentioned how when Mill and Bentham differ, it seems to be nothing substantial, but rather just sort of how they refer to things and the terminology they use. And so I mentioned at that point, right, that Bentham usually invokes this idea of the utility principle, whereas Mill he'll use the utility principle as well, but he'll oftentimes call it the greatest happiness principle. And so they're both referring to the same principle, this sort of mantra of the utilitarians, right, the guiding principle of utilitarianism. So in its most general form, the idea is, right, that individuals, societies, governments, whatever is capable of moral action, ought to act in a manner that yields the greatest happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. Okay. Would a given action yield more happiness or pleasure if you engaged in it? If the answer is yes, then the idea is you have a moral obligation then to do it, because in doing it you would promote greater happiness for the greatest number. Okay. Conversely, right, the idea is if you mull it over and you figure out, well, in doing X, right, I'm going to diminish overall happiness, then you have an obligation not to do it. Okay, pretty straightforward. So let's turn then to slide 15, where we kind of just summarize all that. So this is a quote from Bentham. So when deciding whether a given action is good or bad, good or right or bad or wrong, quote, take the balance, which if on the side, right? So you're analyzing the extent to which it promotes pleasure and pains. So, quote, take the balance, which if on the side of pleasure, will give the general good tendency of the act with respect to the total number of community of individuals concerned. If on the side of pain, the general evil tendency with respect to the same community. So, we've been harkening back on this example of lying. The idea would be, measure, see how when someone lies, how that affects everyone, right, that's involved, the liar themselves, people that are affected by the lie and so on. And he's saying, take on a whole the consequences. If they tend to be evil or painful, or more evil or painful, or I should say, let me rephrase that. If they tend to be more painful on a whole, then we ought to construe them as wrong or evil or bad, however you want to put it, right? If conversely, on a whole, if it tended to make us happier, experience more pleasure, then it would be the right or good thing to do. And so, going back to why the utilitarian says lying is wrong, it's because on a whole, on a balance, as Bentham would say, it tends to yield more pain, all things considered, than pleasure. And so, therefore, on a whole, lying is wrong for the utilitarians. Okay, so hopefully at this point you have a good kind of general sense of utilitarianism, you have a good sort of sense of what hedonism is through our previous lecture, and then also sort of through the things we've been saying through this lecture. And you can see then the way it is, the ways in which hedonism is very influential, and things that Epicurus said, for example, are very influential and shine through in utilitarianism then. Okay? The sorts of things that, again, Bentham and Mill both say. So I want to spend a few moments to discuss some of the other particulars of Bentham's theory as well. He famously denied any notion of natural rights. He said it is nonsense, basically, like this idea that, so a right in the sense of something we're owed, right? He says that the idea that we're owed anything naturally or by birth, just by, the idea of inalienable rights, then, for example, he thinks that's nonsense. We're not owed anything by birth. Just because of the way we are, that we're human. No, that's not true. We're nothing. Not even remember the right of nature for house. We always ought to have the right to do whatever is necessary to survive. Not even that's owed to us. Nothing's owed to us, naturally by birth. Okay, so already that is at odds with what a lot of people think, right? Anybody that embraces the idea of inalienable rights, right? The United Nations, for example, would seem to be at odds with Bentham then, because he's saying, no, we're not owed anything by nature. Just because we're human, we're not owed a certain set of considerations or something like that. So no, and a lot of people want to say, well, there's something special about us, right? We have this rational capacity or whatever it is that makes us human, and isn't that itself then, doesn't that itself engender some degree of respect, or shouldn't that elicit some sort of right or respect that we're afforded? And he says no, right? There's nothing special about it. Just because we have a rational capacity or we're human, right? We're not owed anything by nature, by birth. Okay? There's nothing special about us. Conversely, so if that's the case, if we have no natural rights, insofar as we have any rights, and again, we're talking about rights in sort of a what we're owed sort of sense, insofar as we think we're owed something, right, and people seem to respect that, well, then it must have been socially instituted, right, by way of our customs and laws. It wasn't something that we had by birth or by nature, but rather all rights that we have are socially instituted by way of our customs and laws and so on. Okay, so again, rights don't come naturally. Insofar as we have rights at all, it's because we've agreed to extend them to one another, right? It's a matter of custom, it's something that we've done socially. It's not something that's natural. Okay? So that's going to be important then, because it's going to connect, right, to his feelings on animal rights. Okay, so and I actually have a very vivid memory of a student. It's probably been 5-10 years now, but she was actually familiar with Bentham, and it's because he was one of the first prominent defenders of animal rights. And she was, obviously, not obviously, but she was a big defender of animal rights as well. So she was familiar with Bentham because, again, he is one of the first people to really come to the forefront in terms of trying to defend, the rights of animals. Not to say put them on par with humans, but at least to suggest that they're owed a much greater degree of consideration and respect than tends to be given to them. Okay, so and how he arrives at those views regarding animal rights, I think, is in some way connected to his views of natural rights and the idea that, hey, we're not owed anything just because we're human or we have a rational capacity. There's nothing special about reason per se when it comes to, or there shouldn't be anything special about reason when it comes to considerations of morality. And so that actually, right, how important is reason? I mentioned that that's going to be an important sort of issue in moral discussion. Right? How big of a role should reason play? And I mentioned that in lecture 1, that for some people like Immanuel Kant and the deontologists, it's all about reason. Thanks to our rational capacity, it's thanks to our rational capacity that we even have the ability to figure out what's right and wrong, that we're even worthy of moral respect, so says Immanuel Kant and the deontologists. But we're going to see here Bentham, no. Right? Reason's useful insofar as it allows us to help discern what the proper courses of action and how to get what we want and so on. But it's not the locus or the reason why we're worthy of moral respect or consideration. Right? It's not this this essential moral element that Kant and the deontologists make it out to be. So says Bentham. Right? Rather, what matters for Bentham, it's not can we think or speak, but can we feel, right? Pleasures and pains. That's what matters. And since that's what matters, not that we can think and reason, and that we have this ability to reason, but that we can feel pleasures and pains, since that's what matters, and since other animals can also feel those sorts of things, you can see where he goes then. Why then aren't we extending the same sorts of considerations we extend to one another, right, to other sentient creatures who are equally capable of feeling pleasures and pains? Or maybe not equally, but they also feel pleasures and pains, right? If morality should, as Bentham thinks, be grounded in these considerations and pains and pleasures, and we ought to be trying to promote pleasures and avoiding pains, well, these are the kinds of things we should consider with respect to all creatures capable of experiencing the pleasures and pains, not just human beings. Okay, so again, going to natural rights, does he believe in natural rights? No, right? That was the gist of slide 16. Turning to slide 17, right? He wants to address, well, who should we apply rights to? Again, the upshot of slide 16, this discussion of natural rights, is we're the ones socially instituting rights insofar as they exist, right? So who should we extend them to? He wants to say all sentient creatures. Okay? He downplays the role of reason, as we talked about. What matters, since what matters is the ability to feel pleasures and pains, and we're the ones instituting the rights. Okay, why aren't we then instituting them across the board for all sentient creatures? Ultimately, what matters when it comes to making these kinds of moral decisions is not, quote, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Right? That's the essential question for Bentham. So insofar as our legal, and this is turning to page or slide 18, insofar as our legal and moral decisions ought to be dictated by hedonistic utilitarian considerations and not by our natural capacity, our ability to reason, and so on. Bentham sees no reason why animals, who again are subject to the same sorts of pains and pleasures, why they shouldn't receive essentially the same considerations, or at least, a much greater degree of consideration than we've been offering them. Now, since Bentham's time, you could probably make the argument that we've come a long way, at least from, the animal rights defenders' perspective. But I think they'd still, if Bentham was around, and animal rights defenders today would still say we have a long way to go, right? That, and he says, look, it's not that it's not appropriate to kill an animal or hunt an animal, right? Look, your pleasure and your need to eat and so on, that all goes into the utility calculation. His point, though, is we should still, though, at least be considering how we are affecting these other sentient creatures, right? And for sure, it shouldn't be torturing them. If we have to kill them for sustenance and to eat and so on, at the very least, we should be making it as pain-free as possible, right? But I just want to point out, he's not saying, dismissing altogether, killing animals or, hunting or things like that, but rather he wants to say, at the very least, we ought to be considering the animals more, right? And factoring them in. Granted, we need to eat, our pleasures and pains matter, right? Well, theirs matter too, and they should at least go into the calculation. That's the upshot. So he says, right, he thinks, obviously in his day, right, he didn't think that was the case, right? People were neglecting animal rights all the time. So he says things like, quote, the day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them, but by the hand of tyranny. We're acting like tyrants, right? Instituting these moral rights, but only for other humans and not other sentient creatures. Also note that Mill agrees with Bentham, right, as he applies the utilitarian standard. So Mill, who we're going to talk about in the next lecture, Mill applies the utilitarian standard, quote, so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So Mill, again, the subject of the next lecture on refined utilitarianism, is going to be on board here too. We ought to be considering animal rights, or we ought to be extending rights to animals, at least to a much greater extent than we seem to be, okay, at least in their time. You get the idea. So let's go ahead. So there's been some interesting things here where we fleshed out kind of the nuances of Bentham's moral theory itself. Let's take a look at some interesting objections to at least this original rough, crude formulation of utilitarianism. Okay, so I mentioned in the previous, or part one, that I like to, as we go through these moral theories, allude to some of the criticisms, right, some of the issues. And so Robert Nozick was a famous American philosopher who taught at Harvard, particularly prominent, as I mentioned, on slide 19 in the 70s and 80s. He offered two hypothetical thought experiments that sort of eliminated issues, right, criticisms, if you will, with, at the very least, the rough, crude formulation of utilitarianism that Bentham offered us, right? So if all you're going to tell us, Bentham, is we ought to promote the greatest happiness or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, Bentham, or Nozick's going to say, I've got a couple issues. What about these problems? So we have one, the utility monster, and then we have what's famously known as the experience machine. So again, these are both hypothetical thought experiments that this Robert Nozick, American philosopher, offered as sort of ways that we can think about utilitarianism to help us figure out it's not as appealing as it might seem, or so thought Nozick. Okay, so we'll turn to slide 20 and talk about the utility monster. So the idea is like this. So the gist of it is, let's say you, right, whatever your name is, you're a big Guinness fan, or you like your water. I always go around here, drive my kids nuts because I'm a big runner, and I'm always talking about how much I love ice cold water. There's nothing better, right? It's a bottle of ice cold water. Let's say I'm the utility monster. I'll be the utility monster for this. Okay, I get so much satisfaction out of consuming that resource, right? Let's say it overjoys me so much I get 100 units of pleasure from it. By the way, this is one of the issues that people have had with utilitarianism. How do you measure pleasure or happiness? And so actually, when they've done experiments, they'll use this idea of a util, right? A util to try to capture a unit of pleasure or happiness, right? So, but that's an issue in itself. How do you even measure pleasure or happiness? Okay, so, but let's assume we could, for the sake of argument. So we're talking about the utility monster, and we're on slide 20 here. Okay, so we have two different possibilities. So there's 10 of us, for the sake of argument, to make this simple. 10 of us in the room, okay, including the utility monster. I'm the utility monster. Utility monster meaning someone, right, figuratively speaking, who generates a lot more units or utils, units of pleasure from a resource than others, right? So I like the bottles of water so much that I get, let's say, 10 utils every time I consume one, whereas everyone else only gets one. Okay, so course of action A, feed the utility monster. So, in other words, hey, he generates, if we give, so we have 10 bottles of water, and there's 10 of us, okay? So we have 10 bottles of water. If we do option A, the idea is we give all 10 bottles to the utility monster, because 10 times 10 equals 100. We would have 100 utils. Now, what would happen if we went with a fair distribution, something along the lines of one bottle for everybody? We would get, everybody else would get one, so there's 9 others, they would get one per, so that's 9, plus the 10 I would get from my 1 equals 19. So, hopefully you're seeing where this is going. Nozick's saying, look, if all you're going to tell me is do whatever promotes the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, or do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, without saying anything more, that seems to be problematic because it doesn't seem to take into account other things we care about, like, for example, fair distribution. Well, do we really, just because on the face of it, right, if all we're supposed to do is do whatever promotes the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, A, right? A would be the thing we should do, and that's the problem for Nozick, right? Does that really seem like the thing we ought to do? Give the utility monster all the resources. That doesn't quite seem fair, right? And so that's the issue he wants to point out. You need to offer us something more, right? This isn't good enough. It's more nuanced than you were suggesting, right? It can't just be do whatever promotes the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, or we're going to be feeding utility monsters and neglecting others, right? We're just going to not give them water because giving the utility monster the water would generate more happiness, all things considered. And now, in fairness to more contemporary utilitarians, right, they recognize this sort of issue, and they're going to account for it in their theories. They're going to say things like, well, right, we all need to meet a minimum, right, a floor, a basic threshold. So in this instance, let's give everybody one bottle, and then if there's any surplus, well, then you'd feed it to the utility monster. Right? So the idea is they recognize and account for issues like fairness and distribution and so on. And so this, to his credit, right, this does seem to be an issue and again, utilitarians, more contemporary utilitarians, they're going to try to account for it. They're not going to just offer, this very general, do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? Because otherwise you're going to have issues like this. So that's the utility monster. Be familiar with that and kind of how it works, right? Pretty straightforward, I think. Okay, then we have the even more famous experience machine. I really wish they alluded to it in the introduction, but I wish my previous textbook they actually had an excerpt from it. It's pretty good. But basically the idea is, so imagine an experience machine, right? So such an experience machine, as Nozick says when describing it, quote, would give you any experience you desired, end quote. Again, these are all taken from my previous textbook. Quote, super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel or making a friend or reading an interesting book. So the moral question becomes, should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experiences? Hey, this sounds awesome, right? I mean, we plug in, and then the idea is you can pre-program the experience to be exactly how you want, right? And so unlike real life, when you work hard and hard and hard, and yet you never have any guarantee that you're going to make it to the top of the mountain, right? You want to be the next great novelist, and you write novel after novel, you send it out to all these different publishers. There's no guarantee in real life that you're going to get published or you're going to succeed. But in an experience machine, right, you're programming it, so you're guaranteed success. And now, if you might be of the opinion, well, look, if things are too easy, it won't actually be as good, right? If things are just handed to me because it's this experience machine, I won't appreciate it as much. It's better in real life because then I have to work for things. Hey, we can take that into account too. Program in the experience machine a few trials and tribulations. But unlike real life, you can still program and make sure that you're going to overcome them and succeed. So, hey, doesn't that sound pretty darn good? Right? Why not plug in? And so that's the question. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-program your life's experiences? Okay, now what would the hedonist suggest? Supposedly, if we turn to 22, right, it would seem like if this really did maximize our experience of pleasure, right, because we can program it so as to experience maximal pleasure, then we would seemingly want to plug in. But Nozick thinks, since most of us are repulsed by this idea, nobody in their right mind would want to plug into such a machine. Which, by the way, is he being presumptuous? I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll see if any of you are going to plug in. I think that's one of the questions. But he seems to think we'd all be, obviously revolted by that idea, and so he thinks that's evidence then against this idea of hedonism, that all that matters to us is the experience of pleasure and the lack of an experience of pain. Because if that was all that matters to us, we would all be immediately signing up for this experience machine. So as Louis Poyman, that's the editor of my previous textbook, as he points out or suggests, quote, the fact that most of us are revolted by this idea of plugging into the machine is good evidence against the claims of hedonism, as well as for a wider view of what is good. Now remember, when he's saying what is good, he's meaning in that specific sense of what we desire or want to bring about in our life. Remember, we talked about that in the first part. Okay, so he's saying, look, because we're not all willing to plug in, this indicates that the hedonists are not right? The hedonists say the only thing that's good, all that's good, is pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Everything we do, right, is for the sake of pleasure and avoiding pain. If that were true, we would plug into the experience machine. Since we don't, right, the idea is, well, then there must be something else we consider good or want to bring about in our experience other than merely pleasure and avoiding pain. Okay? Otherwise, we would plug in. Since we don't, there's something else we care about. There's something else we want. Okay? That's what he means by this seems to be evidence for a wider view of what is good than what the hedonists suggest. So similarly, Nozick himself says, quote, we learn that something matters to us in addition to experience by imagining an experience machine and then realizing that we would not use it. Again, would we not use it? I'm not sure. Do we not use an experience machine when we play video games? Do we not use an experience machine when we get wasted at the bar on the weekend and escape reality? Do we not use experience machines all the time to escape reality? Who's to say that we wouldn't sign up and plug into this experience machine? These guys seem to think we wouldn't, but again, I believe that's, what is that? Question 3 on reflection time question. But are they wrong? Maybe you guys would. We'll see. Okay, so hopefully, again, if they're right, Poyman and Nozick, if they're right, most of us would be repulsed by this notion of an experience machine that wouldn't plug in. Then hopefully you can see why they're bringing it up and how they think it's problematic for someone like Bentham. Bentham, you can't be right. Not everything we do is as a result of this pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, because we're not signing up for this experience machine. So Nozick, for what it's worth, points out three problems he thinks we all have with this experience machine, and that's what I'm going at or getting at on slide 23 here. He says we want to do certain things and not just have the experiences of doing them. In the case of certain experiences, it is only because first we want to do the actions that we want the experiences of doing them or thinking we've done them, end quote. The second and third things resonate a lot more with me than that first one. So he says, again, this one makes a lot of sense to me. He says, quote, we want to be a certain way, to be a certain sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob. And so that makes sense, right? That's kind of unsettling, this idea that if we plug in a machine, we're just actually sitting there like a blob, not actually doing anything. That's unsettling. That doesn't sit well with us, right? We want to really, really be doing this. Although, by the way, we're going to wake you up here in a moment. You're actually plugged in the experience machine, and you had instructed us after this video to finally wake you up. But we want to be a certain way, right? So it says no, we want to actually do things and not just be hooked up to a machine. How would we know any different if we were hooked up to a machine? I don't know. But we want to be a certain way and not, right, hooked up to a machine. Such a machine, the third thing he says, quote, limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than that which people can construct. And I think, end quote, and I think what he's getting at there is when we sign up for this experience machine, right, we're kind of limited to the know-how that we have at the moment. What about all the great things that happen when we're a blob tied up to this machine? And so he actually qualifies it and says, well, hey, look, you can come out of the machine every 6 months, or I forgot exactly, how long, but every period of time you can come out and, sort of see what's advanced and how things are now and tweak your experience machine, right, and then go back in. And he says, well, that will eliminate the third problem here, but with the first two, right, are still remain. And so regardless, ultimately, we find the experience machine unsettling. And ultimately, right, the idea is that we desire or want to bring about more than just experiencing pleasure and avoiding pain. There's something else we consider good, right? It's not good enough to just think of what's good or desirable as just being pleasure and avoiding pain. Okay, and I lay out kind of the formal argument, if you will, and I think it's good to kind of review that on slide 24, right? So if you think about it formally, if we were to write it out like an argument, right, we talked about that in lecture 2, so you can see how it would formally look like an argument. So the formal argument underlying the thought experiment. So according to hedonism, the only thing that is good in itself is the experience of pleasure. That's what the hedonists suggest. That's what Epicurus suggested, that's what Bentham suggested, and that's what Mill will suggest. Now, if this were true, premise 2, we would choose to plug in the experience machine, right? Since it's maximizing the experience of pleasure, right? But in fact, premise 3, we choose not to plug into the experience machine. So if you take all three of those and they're all right, then the conclusion would follow. Thus, we consider something other than the mere experience of pleasure good or desirable, and hence hedonism must be incorrect. Right? Epicurus, Bentham, Mill, these guys must all be wrong. Okay, and now, I guess, right, what I was getting at is premise 3, right? Are they right? Are we not going to be willing to plug into the experience machine? I'm not so sure. And so that's a nice segue actually to then slide 25, which is really the end of the lecture, right? The reflection time questions. I really like some of these. These are some of this engenders some of the best classroom discussion typically, some of these issues. I've really wrestled with some of this quite a bit myself. Animal rights, for example. I have my extended family is largely in like rural Nebraska. They're big time hunter and fisherman type people, versus me. I've always lived in the city and not that way. And so I have a vivid memory when I was younger, going in with them and checking traps, and we came in and they had caught something, and I was just kind of sick to my stomach. I made them let it go. Of course, that was probably way worse than just ending its life for it at the time. But that always just stuck out to me, and little things like that, or even fishing. I always enjoyed like fishing with them growing up. But then, as I would fish, couldn't help but envision like a hook going in, and just is there that pain? And I know the argument is like not all sentient creatures experience pains and pleasures to the extent we do, and I know there's something to be said for that. But the whole point is this is something that I've kind of thought about myself. And for what it's worth, I'm actually a vegetarian, but it's not for moral reasons really. But it is interesting that nonetheless I have sort of thought about these, the issues as well. So that's something I'm sure that's true of a lot of you guys, that you probably wrestled with these issues. No doubt some of you are probably big time animal rights defenders. No doubt there's some of you that are probably hunter, like to hunt and fish, like a lot of my family, extended family. And so I mentioned we're going to have all kinds of issues throughout the semester where we'll differ considerably on, and I think this is oftentimes one of them in the classroom, where we have very divided opinions. Bentham can be very divisive in that sense with respect to what he says about animal rights. So that would be question 2, kind of gets at, what are your thoughts on animal rights? Does Bentham have some good points? What'd you have for dinner? That sort of thing. Question 1 is more your general thoughts on hedonistic utilitarianism. Do you agree with this idea that what's morally appropriate is steered by considerations of happy or pleasurable consequences? Is that what matters morally when we think we're doing the right thing? Is it because we think we've done things that promote consequences that are pleasurable? Is that what we mean when we say we do the right thing? That's the implication of Bentham and these other utilitarians. The third question, again, goes back to the experience machine. Were these guys right to suggest that we were repulsed by it and that we wouldn't plug in? Okay. So hopefully you enjoyed our initial discussion of utilitarianism. Again, we'll be fleshing this out in much more detail as we go forward. Next lecture, we'll be talking about Mill, who's going to come along, I would argue, advance pretty much the same theory as Bentham, but in a much more refined manner, hence refined utilitarianism, the title of the lecture. He's going to answer a lot of the criticisms. We'll cover, one of the things we'll do towards the end of the lecture is review some of the most common criticisms of utilitarianism, and then address what Mill had to say in response, his rebuttals, if you will. And then we'll go on after that, we'll discuss a more contemporary defense of utilitarianism through Kai Nielsen, a contemporary utilitarian. So again, we'll be developing utilitarianism here for quite a bit of time. And then even when we move on to deontology, as I mentioned earlier, we'll still be discussing utilitarianism indirectly. So if you have any questions, like always, feel free to reach out to me. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture and it makes sense. Stay tuned for refined utilitarianism in the next lecture.